There is a database maintained by the Kansas State Historical Society that lists every recorded orphan train stop in the state between 1866 and 1929. Town names, dates, number of children placed, names of receiving families, dry bureaucratic columns, the kind of record that looks like nothing until you put it next to something else. I put it next to fire maps. Specifically, I put it next to the insurance underwriter reports filed with the Kansas State Legislature between 1860 and 1880, which document every town-level fire event serious enough to trigger a commercial loss claim. Those reports exist because the insurance industry needed them. They're not dramatic documents. They're actuarial, which means they're precise. When you overlay the two records, something happens that I have not been able to explain away. The orphan trains did not go to thriving towns. They did not cluster around established farming communities with stable tax bases and growing populations. When you trace the actual routing stop by stop, county by county, what you find is that an extraordinary number of the destinations had experienced a significant fire event within the preceding 3 to 7 years. Not every stop, but enough stops that the pattern stopped feeling like coincidence. Somewhere around the 4th state. I checked. I want to be careful about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that Charles Loring Brace sat in a room and deliberately routed trains to burn towns on a map. I am claiming that the data does not support the story we have been told about what the orphan trains were actually for. And those are two very different claims. The official history is one of the more emotionally legible stories in American social reform. Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853 after walking the streets of Lower Manhattan and documenting what he described as an army of street children, somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000, depending on which account you read. His solution was removal. Get the children out of the corrupting urban environment. Place them with wholesome rural families where clean air and honest labor would produce useful citizens. Between 1854 and 1929, roughly 250,000 children made that journey. The story has been told as philanthropy so many times that the philanthropic framing has become invisible. The way water is invisible to fish. But Brace was not primarily a humanitarian. He was an economist. His 1872 book, The Dangerous Classes of New York, is not a tract about child welfare. It is a tract about urban labor surplus and social control. Brace was explicit that the street children represented what he called a dangerous criminal class in formation, and that the threat was not to the children but to the social order. The program was designed in his own words to drain off this population before it could organize, radicalize, or cost the city money in institutionalization. That framing matters enormously when you look at where the trains actually went. In 1871, Fresno County, California, lost approximately 40% of its agricultural infrastructure to fire. Orphan train stops in Fresno County began appearing in placement records within 4 years. In 1873, a fire complex across 3 counties in central Illinois destroyed grain storage and killed between 12 and 20 farm workers, a number difficult to pin down because the workers were seasonal migrants whose deaths were not consistently documented. Orphan train stops in those same counties appear by 1876. In 1874, a fire that started in a textile warehouse moved through a residential district in Mon, Georgia, and displaced an estimated 400 families. Children's Aid Society placement records show Bibb County, Georgia receiving orphan train children beginning in 1877. I checked Michigan. I checked Indiana. I checked Missouri and Nebraska and Minnesota. The pattern holds. There is an obvious counterargument, and I want to address it directly because it is the first thing a reasonable person thinks. Towns that had recently burned were towns in active rebuilding phases. Rebuilding phases needed labor. If you were routing trains toward places that could absorb children into working households, you would naturally wait toward places with labor deficits. And places that had recently lost workers to fire or displacement would show up disproportionately in any routing that was even vaguely economically rational. That argument is correct. And it is also the argument I am making because that argument means the orphan trains were a labor routing operation wearing the costume of a child welfare program. And those are not the same thing. A child welfare program asks whether the child was placed in a safe and loving home. A labor routing operation asked whether the destination received an adequate number of workers at an acceptable cost per unit. The Children's Aid Society's own records suggest which question they were actually asking. Brace's organization tracked placements not by well-being outcomes, but by something he called industrial absorption, a metric that measured whether the child had been integrated into productive labor within the receiving household. Letters sent back to the society from receiving families were evaluated based on whether the child was working and whether the family considered the arrangement satisfactory. Not whether the child was healthy, not whether the child was educated, whether the arrangement was satisfactory to the family. The families were the customers. Who funded the operation that served those customers? This is where the paper trail gets uncomfortable. The Children's Aid Society received substantial support from New York's merchant and manufacturing class throughout the 1860s and 1870s. Names that appear repeatedly in the donation ledgers include representatives of the railroad industry, specifically the Erie Railroad and later the New York Central, both of which had direct economic interest in the western and midwestern territories where the trains were being sent. The railroads did not charge full fare for the orphan train cars. They offered deeply discounted rates that amounted to near subsidization. Railroads actively developing land grants in underpopulated territories were subsidizing the transport of labor to those territories disguised as charity. I found a document I want to describe carefully because I am working from a transcription and cannot verify it the original at present. It is referenced in a 1947 academic paper on the Orphan Train movement published in a Missouri Historical Review journal, and it is described as an internal Children's Aid Society operational memo from approximately 1869. The memo, as quoted in the 1947 paper, discusses routing considerations for the following year's placements. The language, as transcribed, includes a phrase about prioritizing communities, exhibiting conditions favorable to absorption with conditions favorable to absorption defined as recent population loss, active reconstruction, or demonstrated shortage of juvenile labor. Conditions favorable to absorption. That phrase was written about children. The 1947 paper that quotes this memo treats it as a straightforward administrative document. The author does not appear to find the language remarkable, which tells you something about 1947 and something about the century of framing that had already made the language invisible. The children who arrived were not told where they were going. This is documented extensively in survivor accounts compiled in the 1980s and 1990s when enough former train riders were still alive to give oral testimony. They were told they were going to good homes in the country. What almost none of them were told was the destination town, the name of the receiving family, or any information that would allow them, if the placement was bad, to contact someone outside the immediate community. This was not an oversight. The Society's placement guidelines, revised in 1868 and again in 1876, explicitly instructed agents not to provide children with information about alternative contacts or complaint mechanisms until the placement had been deemed stable. Stable was defined as one full agricultural season, which meant that if a child arrived in spring and the placement was brutal, they had until autumn before anyone was obligated to check on them. Children who ran from bad placements were legally categorized as vagrant, returning them to exactly the institutional pipeline they had been extracted from. They had no legal standing to refuse the placement. They had no legal standing to contact their biological families, most of whom had been told that contact would harm the child's adjustment. The system was closed. I have been trying to find a single documented instance where a Children's Aid Society placement agent raised an objection to routing children to a recently burned town. Not to the practice as a whole. Just one agent writing that this community lost its adult workforce to fire and that the children were being sent as replacement labor rather than as children receiving homes. I have not found that document. What I have found is a letter from 1882 written by a placement agent named Catherine Sellers working a route through central Iowa. Sellers writes to her supervisor about a town she had visited and was now being asked to revisit for a second placement cohort. She notes that the children from the first cohort were well occupied but not schooled beyond the minimum, and that several boys were performing labor she would describe as intensive for their ages. She asked whether it is appropriate to continue sending children to this community. Her supervisor's response is 3 sentences. He acknowledges her concern. He notes that the receiving families have expressed satisfaction with the arrangements. He instructs her to proceed. Satisfaction of the receiving families. That was the metric. That was the entire answer to her question. Catherine Sellers continued making placements in that community for 4 more years. The economic logic explained something that has always been treated as a humanitarian puzzle. The Orphan Train movement operated for 75 years. For most of that period, it was underfunded and understaffed, running on the organizational energy of true believers who genuinely thought they were saving children. I do not doubt that many placement agents went to sleep at night thinking they had done something good. But the funding that kept the operation alive did not come from people motivated by child welfare. It came from people motivated by the economics of territorial development. And territorial development in the second half of the 19th century meant land that had been cleared, whether by fire, displacement, or population loss, needed to be repopulated with labor that was cheap, controllable, and legally tied to the land through the placement agreement. The Orphan Trains were, in economic terms, an internal migration program. The largest internal migration program in American history before the New Deal run through private hands funded by the industries that benefited from the migration. Aimed at destinations. Those industries were simultaneously developing. We called it charity because charity was the only language available for moving that many children without triggering a legal response. The moment you call it what the documents suggest it actually was, which is organized labor transfer, the entire operation looks different. The routing decisions look different. The burned towns look very different. The WPA Oral History Collection at the Library of Congress includes testimony from elderly Americans interviewed in 1936 and 1937, who grew up in receiving communities and watched the trains arrive. Several described the event not as a charitable occasion, but as something closer to a market day. Children lined up on platforms or in church halls. Families walking through and selecting. The language is matter-of-fact. No outrage. No awareness that anything was unusual because for those communities there was nothing unusual about it. It was how labor arrived. One testimony from a man identified in the records as J.H. of Pottawatomie County, Kansas, interviewed in 1937, describes watching an arrival as a boy of approximately 9. He says the bigger boys were the ones the farmers wanted first. The smaller ones waited longer. One boy younger than him sat on a trunk for most of the afternoon and was still sitting there when his family left. He does not know what happened to that boy. That boy, if placed that day, would have spent his childhood in Pottawatomie County, working land that had been through at least 2 significant fire events in the preceding decade. He would have had no recourse if the placement was bad. He would have had no address where a biological family could be reached because the society did not provide that information. He would have grown up with a savored past and a present defined entirely by the labor needs of the family that selected him from a church hall in a burned and rebuilding county. He would have had grandchildren. Those grandchildren would have been told a family story that began for all practical purposes with an arrival. A trunk on a platform. A farm in Kansas no before. The Orphan Trains are taught as a well-intentioned but flawed experiment in child welfare. The well-intentioned framing is doing significant work in that sentence. It asks you to evaluate the program by the intentions of its most idealistic participants rather than by the structure of its funding, the logic of its routing, or the experience of the children it moved. The structure of the funding pointed toward territorial development interests. The logic of the routing pointed toward labor deficit communities, and those communities had with a frequency that exceeds statistical coincidence recently lost population to fire. The experience of the children included legal mechanisms that made bad placements inescapable. Information control that severed them from their pasts and performance metrics that measured their value to receiving families rather than their welfare as children. Those 3 facts together are not a story about well-intentioned failure. They are a story about a system that worked exactly as its economic architecture required it to work. The burned towns needed labor. The cities had surplus children that the merchant class found threatening. The railroads needed Western territories populated enough to support freight revenue. The Children's Aid Society needed funding. For problems, one solution dressed in the language of rescue. The insurance underwriter reports are in the State Historical Society archives. The Children's Aid Society records are held at the Social Welfare History Archives at the University of Minnesota. The railroad subsidy agreements are in the Interstate Commerce Commission records. The WPAI oral histories are at the Library of Congress. None of these documents are hidden. They have been available for decades. They have simply never been placed next to each other on the same table and read in sequence. I placed them on the same table, and what I read does not match the story in the textbook. The burned towns were not accidents in the routing. The burned towns were the point. And the children who arrived on those platforms, selected from church halls by farmers who needed their hands, never knew enough about where they had come from to ask the question that would have unraveled the whole arrangement. Where did you find us? And why here? And why now? The documents know the answer. The children never.